Hello, my friends. It's Indiana Holmes for Story Time. And tonight we continue with our new book, A Silent Witness. We begin tonight with Chapter 3, Who is Sylvia? The winter session had commenced at the hospital, but at Hampstead the month of October had set in with something like a return to summer. It is true that the trees had lost something of their leafy opulence, and that here and there, amidst the sober green patches of russet and gold, had made their appearance as if nature's color orchestra were tuning up for the final symphony. But meanwhile the sun shone brightly, and with a genteel heat, and if day by day he fell farther from the zenith, there was nothing to show it but the lengthening noonday shadows, the warmer blue of the sky, and the more rosy tint of the clouds that sailed across it. Other than more capable pens than mine have set forth the charm of autumn and the beauties of Hampstead, queen of suburbs of the world's metropolis. Therefore I will refrain, and only note as relevant to the subject the fact that many on a day when the work of the hospital was in full swing, I might have been seen playing truant very agreeably on inexhaustible heath, or in the lanes and fields adjacent thereto. In truth, I was taking the final stage of my curriculum rather lazily, having worked hard enough in the earlier years, and being still too young by several months to be admitted to the fellowship of the College of Surgeons, promising myself that when the weather broke I would settle down in earnest to the winter's work. I have mentioned that Millfield Lane was one of my favorite haunts. Indeed, from my lodgings it was the most direct route to the heath, and I passed along it almost daily, and never, now, without my thoughts turning back to that rainy night when I had found the dead or unconscious man lying across the narrow footway. One morning as I passed the spot, it occurred to me to make a drawing of the place in my sketchbook, that I might have some memorial of the strange adventure. The pictorial possibilities of the lane just here were not great, but by taking my stand at the turn, on the very spot where I had seen the body lying, I was able to arrange a simple composition, which was satisfactory enough. I am no artist. A neat and intelligible drawing is the utmost that I can produce, but even this modest degree of achievement may be very useful, as I had discovered many a time in the wards or laboratories. Indeed, I have often been surprised that the instructors of our youth attach such small value to the power of graphic expression, and it came in usefully now, though in a way that was unforeseen and not fully appreciated. At the moment, I had dealt adequately with the fence, the posts, the tree trunks, and the other well-defined forms, and was beginning a less successful attack on the foliage, when I heard a light, quick step approaching from Hampstead Lane. Intuition, if there is such a thing, fitted the footstep with a personality, and for once in a way I was right. As the newcomer reached the sharp bend of the path, I saw a girl of about my own age, simply and serviceably dressed, and carrying a pocade box and a small camp stool. She was not an entire stranger to me. I had met her often in the lane and on the heath, so often, in fact, that we had developed that profound unconsciousness of one another's existence that almost amounts to recognition, and had wondered vaguely who she was and what sort of work she did on the panels in that mysterious box. As I drew back to make my way for her, she brushed past with a single quick, inquisitive glance at my sketchbook, and went on her way, looking very much alive and full of business. I watched her as she tripped down the lane and passed between the posts out into the sunlight beyond, to vanish behind the trunks of the elms Then I returned to my sketch and my struggles to express foliage with a touch somewhat less suggestive of birch broom. When I had finished my drawing, I sauntered, or rather aimlessly speculating for the 100th time on the meaning of those discoveries of mine at this very lane. Was it possible that the man whom I had seen was not dead, but merely insensible? I could not believe it. The whole set of circumstances, the aspect of the body, the blood stain on the fence, the tracks through the high grass, and the mysterious gold trinket were opposed to any such belief. Yet, on the other hand, one would think that a man could not disappear unnoticed. This was no tramp or nameless vagrant. He was a clergyman or a priest, a man who would be known to a great number of persons, and whose disappearance must surely be observed at once and be the occasion of very stringent inquiries. But no inquiries had apparently been made. I had seen no notice in the papers of any missing cleric, and clearly the police had heard nothing, or they would have looked me up. The whole affair was enveloped in the profoundest mystery. Dead or alive, the man had vanished utterly, and whether he was dead or alive, the mystery was equally beyond solution. These reflections brought me, almost unconsciously, to another of my favorite walks, the pretty footpath from the heath to the Temple Fortune. I had crossed the stile and stepped off the path to survey the pleasant scene when my eye was attracted by a number of streaks of alien color on the leaves of a burdock. Stooping down, I perceived that they were smears of oil paint, and inferred that someone had cleaned a palette on herbage, an inference that was confirmed a moment later by what looked like the handle of a brush projecting from a clump of nettles. When I drew it out, however, it proved to be not a brush, but a very curious knife, with a blade shaped like a diminutive and attenuated trowel. Evidently a painting knife, and also evidently homemade, at least in part, for the tang had been thrust into a short, stout brush handle and secured with a whipping of wax thread. I dropped it into my outside breast pocket and went on my way, wondering if by chance it might have been dropped by my fair acquaintance, and the thought was still in my mind when the object hove in sight. Turning a bend in path, I came on her quite suddenly, perched on her little camp stool in the shadow of the hedge, with the open sketching box on her knees, working away with an industry and concentration that seemed to rebuke my own idleness. Indeed, she was so much engrossed with her occupation that she did not notice me until I had stepped off the path and approached with the knife in my hand. "I wonder," said I, holding it out and raising my cap, "if this happens to be your property. I picked it up just now among the nettles near the barn." She took the knife from me, looked at it inquisitively. "No," she replied, "it isn't mine, but I think I know whose it is. I suspect it belongs to an artist who has been doing a good deal of work about the heath. You may have seen him. I've seen several artists working about here during the summer. What was this one like?" "Well," she answered with a smile, "he was like an artist, very much like. Quite the orthodox get-up. Wide-brimmed hat, rather long hair, ragged beard. He wore sketching spectacles, half-moon-shaped things, you know, and kid gloves, which were not quite so orthodox. Very convenient, I should think." "Not so very. I work in gloves myself in the cold weather, or if the midges are any troublesome. But you soon get used to the feeling of them, and the man I am speaking of wouldn't find them in the way at all because he works almost entirely with painting knives. That is what made me think of this knife and why it was probably his. He had several, I know, and very skillfully he used them too." "You have seen his work, then?" "Well," she admitted, "I'm afraid I descended once or twice to play the snooper. You see, his method of handling interested me." "May I ask what a stupor is?" I inquired. Don't you know? It's a student slang for some kind of person who makes some transparent pretext for coming off the path and passing behind you to get a look at your picture by false pretenses. For an instant there flashed into my mind the suspicion that she was administering a quiet backhander, and I rejoined hastily, "I hope you are not including me in the genus snooper." She laughed softly. It did not sound rather like it, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt in consideration of your finding the knife, which you had better keep in trust for the owner. Won't you keep it? You know the probable owner by sight, and I don't, and meanwhile you might experiment with it yourself. Very well, she replied, dropping it into her brush tray. I'll keep it for the present rate at any. There was a brief pause, and then I ventured to remark, "That looks a very promising sketch of yours, and how well the subject comes." "I'm glad you like it," she replied, quite simply viewing her work with the head on one side. "I want it to turn out well because it's a commission, and commissions for small oil paintings are rare and precious." "Do you find small oil paintings very difficult to dispose of?" I asked. "Not difficult, impossible as a rule. But I don't try now. I copy my oil sketches in watercolor, with modifications to suit the market." Again there was a pause, and as her brush wandered towards the palette, it occurred to me that I had stayed as long as good manners permitted. Accordingly, I raised my cap, and having expressed the hope that I had not greatly hindered her, prepared to move away. "Oh, not at all," she answered, "and thank you for the knife, though it isn't mine, or, at any rate, wasn't. Good morning." With this, and a pleasant smile and a little nod, she dismissed me, and once more I went my idle and meditative way. It had been quite a pleasant little adventure. There is always something rather interesting in making the acquaintance of a person whom one has known sometime by sight, but who is otherwise an unknown quantity. The voice, the manner, and the little revelations of character which confirm or contradict previous impressions are watched with interest as they develop themselves and fill in, one by one, the blank spaces of the total personality. I had, as I have said, often met this industrious maiden in my walks, and had formed my opinion that she looked a rather nice girl, an opinion that was probably influenced by her unusual good looks and graceful carriage, and a rather nice girl she had turned out to be, very dignified and self-possessed, but quite simple, and frankly, to be sure, her gracious reception of me had probably been due to my sketchbook. She had taken me for a kindred spirit. She had a pleasant voice and a faultless accent, with just a hint of the fine lady in her manner, but I liked her none the less for that. And her name was a pretty name, too, if I had guessed it correctly, for on the inside of the lid of her box, which was partly uncovered by the upright panel, I had read the letters Syl. The panel hid the rest, but the name could hardly be any other than Sylvia. And what more charming and appropriate name could be bestowed upon a comely young woman who spent her days amidst the woods and fields of my beloved Hampstead? Regaling myself with this somewhat small beer, I sauntered along the grassy lane between hedgerows that a summer had been spangled with wild roses, and were now gay with big oval berries, sleek and glossy and scarlet, like overgrown beads of red coral, away across the fields to Golders Green, and thence by Millfield Lane, back to my lodgings at Gospel Oak, and to my landlady, Mrs. Blunt, who had a few plaintive words to say respecting the disastrous effects of punctuality and the resulting prolonged heat on mutton cutlets and fried potatoes. It had been an idle morning and apparently void of significant offense, but yet, when I look back on it, I see a definite thread of causation running through its simple happenings, and I realize that, all unthinkably, I had strung on one more bead to the chaplet of my destiny. Chapter 4. Septimus Madoc, deceased. It was getting well on into November when I strolled one afternoon into the hospital museum, not with any specific object, but rather vaguely in search of something to do. During the last few days, I had developed a slight revival of industry, which had coincided, oddly enough, with a marked deterioration of the weather, and pathology being my weakest point, the museum had seemed to call me, though not very loudly, I fear, to browse amongst the multitudinous jars and dry preparations. There was only one person in the great room, but he was a very important person, being none other than our lecturer on the medical jurisprudence, Dr. John Thorndyke. He was seated at a small table, whereon was set a collection of jars and a number of large photographs, of which he appeared to be making a catalogue, but intent as he was on this occupation, he looked up as I entered and greeted me with a genial smile. "What do you think of my little collection, Jardine?" he asked as I approached deferentially. Before replying, I ran vaguely inquiring eye over the group of the objects on the table, and was mighty little enlightened thereby. It was certainly a queer collection. There was a flat jar, which contained a series of 5 different colored mice, another with a similar series of 3 rats, a human foot, a hand manifestly deformed, a series of 4 fowls' heads, and a number of photographs of plants. "It looks," I replied at length, "like what auctioneers would call a miscellaneous lot." "Yes," Dr. Thorndyke agreed, "it is a miscellaneous collection, in a sense, but there is a connecting idea. It illustrates certain phenomena of inheritance, which were discovered and described by Mendel." "Mendel?" I exclaimed. "Who is he? I never heard of him." "I dare say not," said Thorndyke, "though he published his results before you were born, but the importance of his discoveries is only now beginning to be appreciated." "I suppose," said I, "the subject is too large and complex for a short explanation to be possible." "The subject is a large one, of course," he replied, "but put in a nutshell, Mendel's great discovery amounts to this, that whereas certain characters are inherited only partially and fade off gradually in successive generations, certain other characters are inherited completely and pass unchanged from generation to generation. To take a couple of illustrative cases, if a Negro marries a European, the offspring are mulattoes, forms intermediate between Negro and European. If a mulatto marries a European, the offspring are quadroons, another intermediate form, and next generation gives us the octoroon, intermediate again between quadroon and the European, and so, from generation to generation, the Negro character gradually fades away and finally disappears. But there are other characters which are inherited entire or not at all, and such characters appear in pairs, which are positive or negative to one another. Sex is a case in point. A male marries a female, and the offspring are either male or female, never intermediate. Sex character of only one parent is inherited, and it is inherited completely. The characters of maleness and femaleness pass down unchanged through the ages with no tendency to diminish or fade off into one or the other. That is the case of Mendelian inheritance. I ran my eyes over the collection, and they presently lighted on the rather abnormal-looking foot, hanging, white and shriveled, in the clear spirit. I lifted the jar from the table, and then, noticing for the first time that the foot had a supremacy or toe, I inquired what point the specimen illustrated. That the supernary toe was definitely something that drew my attention. "That 6-toed foot," Thorndyke replied, is an example of a deformity that is transmitted unchanged for an indefinite number of generations. This brachydactylous hand is another instance. The brachydactyly reappears in the offspring, either completely or not at all. There are no intermediate conditions. He picked up the jar and, having wiped the glass with a duster, exhibited the hand which was suspended within, and strange-looking hand it was, broad and stumpy, like the hand of a mole. There seem to be only 2 joints in each finger, I said. Yes, the fingers are all thumbs, and the thumb is only a demi-thumb. A joint is suppressed in each digit. It must make the hand very clumsy and useless, I remarked. One would think it isn't exactly the type of a hand for Lisette or Panini, and yet we mustn't assume too much. I once saw an armless man copying pictures in Luxembourg, and copying them very well, too. He held his brush with his toes, and he was so handy with his feet that he not only painted really dexterously, but managed to take his hat off to a lady with quite a fine flourish. So you see, Jardine, it is not the hand that matters, but rather the brain that actuates it. A very indifferent hand will serve if the motor centers are of the right sort. He replaced the jar on the table, and then, after a short pause, turning quickly to me, he asked, "What are you doing at present, Jardine?" "Principally idling, sir," I replied. "And not a bad thing to do either," he rejoined with a smile, "if you do it thoroughly and don't keep it up too long. How would you like to take charge of a practice for a week or so?" "I don't know that I should particularly care to, sir," I answered. "Why not? It would be a useful experience and would bring you useful knowledge that you have got to acquire sooner or later. Hospital conditions, you know, are not normal conditions. General practice is normal medical practice, and the sooner you get to know the conditions of the great world of the better for you. If you stick to the wards too long, you will get to be like the nurses, who seem to think that all the world's a hospital and men and women only patients." I reflected for a few moments. It was perfectly true. I was a qualified medical man, and yet the ordinary routine of private practice I had not the faintest knowledge. To me, all sick people were either inpatients or outpatients. "Had you any particular practice in your mind, sir?" I asked. "Yes, I met with one of our old students just now. He is at his wit's end to find a locum tenens. He has to go away tonight or tomorrow morning, but he can't get anyone to look after his work. Won't you go to his relief? It's an easy practice, I believe." I turned the question over in my mind and finally decided to try the venture. "That's right," said Dr. Thorndyke. "You'll help a professional brother, at any rate, and pick up a little experience. Our friend's name is Baston, and he lives in Jacob Street, Hampstead Road. I'll write it down." He handed me a slip of paper with the address on it and wished me success, and I started at once for the hospital, already quite elated, as is the way of the youthful, at the prospect of a new experience. Dr. Bastion's establishment in Jacob Street was modest to the verge of dinginess, but Jacob Street itself was dingy, and so was the immediate neighborhood. A district of tall, grimy houses that might easily have seen better days. However, Dr. Batson himself was spruce enough and in excellent spirits at my arrival, as was evident when he bounced into the room with a jovial greeting, bringing in with him a faint aroma of sherry. "Delighted to see you, doctor," he exclaimed in his large, brisk voice. That "doctor" was a diplomatic hit on his part. They don't call newly qualified men doctor at the hospital. "I met Thorndyke this morning and told him of my predicament. A busy man is the great unraveler, but he is never too busy to do a kindness to his friends. Can you take over tonight?" I could, said I. Then do. I want particularly to be off by the 8:30 from Liverpool Street. Drop in and have some grub about 6:30. I shall have polished off the day's work by then, and you'll just come in for the evening consultations. Are there any cases that you will want me to see with you? I asked. Oh, no, Bastian replied. Rather airily, I thought. They're all plain sailing. There's a typhoid. He's doing well, 4th week. And there's a tonsillitis and a psoriasis abscess. That's rather tedious. But still, it's improving. And an old woman with a liver. You won't have any difficulty with them. There's only one queer case, a heart. Valvular? I asked. No, not valvular. I can tell you that much. I know what it isn't, but I'm hanged if I know what it is. Chappie complains of pain, shortness of breath, faintness, and so on, but I can't find anything to account for it. Heart, soul sounds all right. Pulse quite good. No dropsy, no nothing. Seems like a malingering, but I don't see why he should malinger. I think I'll get you to drop in this evening and have a look at him. Are you keeping him in bed? I asked. Yes, Bastian said. I am now. Not that his general condition seems to demand it, but he has had 1 or 2 fainting attacks, and yesterday he must needs fall down flop in his bedroom when there was nobody there, and by way of making things more uncomfortable, he drops his medicine bottle and falls on the fragments. He might have killed himself, you know, Batson added in an aggrieved tone. As it was, a long splinter from the bottom of the bottle stuck into his back, and it made quite a deep little wound. So I've kept him in bed since, out of the harm's way. And there he is, deuced sorry for himself, but, as far as I can make out, without a single tangible symptom. No facial signs? Nothing unusual in his color or expression? Bastian laughed and tapped his gold-rimmed spectacles. Ah, there you are. When you've got -5D and some irregular astigmatism and a pair of glasses that don't correct it, all human beings look pretty much alike. A trifle sketchy, don't you know? I didn't see anything unusual in his face. But you might. Time will show. Now, you cut along and fetch your traps, and I'll skip round and polish off the sufferers. He launched me into the outer grayness of Jacob Street and bounced off in the direction of Cumberland Market, leaving me to pursue my way to the lodgings at Gospel Oak. As I threaded the teeming streets of Camden Town, I meditated on the new experience that was opening to me, and with youthful egotism, I already saw myself making a brilliant diagnosis of an obscure heart case, also reflected with some surprise on the calm view that Batson took of his defective eyesight. A certain type of painter, as I had observed, finds semi-blindness a valuable gift which helps him to eliminate trivial detail and to impart a noble breadth of work to his pictures. But to a doctor, no such self-delusion would seem possible. Visual acuteness is the most precious item in the equipment. I crammed into a large Gladstone bag and the bare necessities for a week's stay, together with a few indispensable instruments, and then mounted the jingling horse tram of whose pre-electric days, which in due course deposited me at the end of Jacob Street, Hampstead Road. Dr. Batson had not returned from his round when I arrived, but a few minutes later he burst into the surgery, humming an air from the Mikado. Ha! Here you are, then, punctual to the minute. He hung his hat on a peg, laid his visiting list on the desk and dispensing counter, and began to compound medicine with the speed of a prestidigitator, talking volubly all the time. That's for the old woman with the liver, Mrs. Mudge, Cumberland Market. You'll see her prescription in the day. Suppose you don't know how to wrap a bottle of medicine. Better watch me. This is the way. He slapped the bottle down on a square piece of cut paper, gave a few dexterous twiddles of his fingers, and held out my inspection a little white parcel like the mummy case of a deceased medicine bottle. It's quite easy when you've had a little practice, he said, deftly sticking the ends down with sealing wax. But you'll make a frightful mucker of it. Which first prophecy was duly fulfilled that very evening. What time had I better see the heart case, said I. Oh, you won't have to see it at all. Man's dead. Message left half an hour ago. Pity, isn't it? I should have liked to hear of what you thought of him. Must have been fatty heart. I'll write about the certificate a while I think of it, Maggie. Where's that note of Mrs. Samway left? The question was roared out vaguely through the open door to a servant unknown whereabouts, and resulted in the appearance of a somewhat scraggy housemaid bearing an open note. Here we are, said Bastian, snatching the note out of his envelope and opening the book of certificate forms. Septimus Maddock was the chappie's name, age 51, address as 23 Grayton Street. Cause of death? That's what I should like to know. Primary cause? Secondary causes? I wish these infernal government clerks had got something better to do than fill printed forms with silly conundrums. I shall put Morbius Cordis. That ought to be enough for them. Mrs. Samway, that's his landlady, you know, will probably call for the certificate during the evening. Aren't you going to inspect the body? I asked. Lord, no. Why should I do that? It isn't necessary, you know. I'm not an undertaker. Wish I was. Dead people are a good deal more profitable than live ones. But surely, I exclaimed, the death ought to be verified. Why, the man must not be dead at all. I know, said Bastian, scribbling away like a minor poet. But that isn't my business. Business of the law. Law wastes your time with a heap of silly questions that don't matter and leaves out the question that does. Asks exact time when I last saw him alive. Which doesn't matter? What doesn't matter? Hang. And doesn't ask whether I saw him dead. Bumble was right. Law's an ass. But still, I persisted, leaving the legal requirements out of consideration. Oughtn't you, for your own sake, and as a public duty, to verify certain deaths, supposing the man were not really dead? That, too, would be awkward for him, said Bastian, and awkward for me, too, if he came to life before they buried him. But it doesn't really happen in real life. Premature burial only occurs in novels. His easygoing confidence jarred me on considerably. How could he, or anyone else, know what happened? I don't see how you arrive at that, I objected. It could only be proved by wholesale disinterment. And the fact remains that if you don't verify a reported death, you have no security against premature burial or even cremation. Batson started up and stared at me, his wide open, pale blue eyes looking ridiculously small through his deep concave spectacles. By Jove, he exclaimed, I am glad you mentioned that about cremation. I mean, because that is what we will probably do. I witnessed the chappie's will a couple of days ago, and remember now that one of the clauses stipulated that his body should be cremated, so I shall have to verify the death for the purpose of cremation certificate. We'd better pop round and see him at once. While characteristic impulsiveness, he sprang to his feet, snatched his hat from the peg, and started forth, leaving me to follow. Beastly nuisance, these spatial regulations, said Bastian, as he ambled briskly up the street. Give a lot of trouble and cause a lot of delay. Isn't the ordinary death certificate sufficient in a case of cremation? I asked. For the purposes of the law, it is, though there is some talk of new legislation on this subject. But the company are a law unto themselves. They have made the most infernally stringent regulations, and as there is no crematorium near London, excepting the one at Working, you have to be able to abide by their rules. And that reminds me, here Bastian halted and scowled at me ferociously through his spectacle. Reminds you, I repeated, that they require a second death certificate signed by a man with certain special qualifications. He stood a while, frowning and muttering under his breath, and then suddenly turned and bounced off in a new direction. Going to catch another chappie and take him with us, he explained, as he darted out into the Hampstead Road. Be off by then. A fellow named O'Connor, assistant physician to the North London Hospital. He'll do if we can catch him. That is, catch him at home. If not, you'll have to manage him. Bastian looked at his watch, holding it within 4 inches of his nose, and broke into a trot as we entered a quiet square. Halfway up, he halted at the door, which bore a modest brass plate inscribed Dr. O'Connor, and seizing the bell knob, worked it vigorously in and out as if it were the handle of an air pump. Doctor, in? He demanded briskly of a startled housemaid, and without waiting for an answer, he darted into the hall, down the whole length of which he staggered, executing a sort of sword dance, having caught his toe on an unobserved doormat. The doctor was in, and he shortly appeared in evening dress, with an overcoat on his arm, and apparently in as great a hurry as Batson himself. Won't it do tomorrow? Asked he, when Bastian had explained his difficulties and the service required. Might as well come now, said Bastian persuasively. Won't take a minute, but then I can go away in peace. Very well, said O'Connor, wriggling into his coat. You go along and I'll follow a few minutes. I've got to look in on a patient on my way up west, and I shall be late for my appointment as it is. Write the address on my card here. He held out a card to my principal, and when the latter had come scribbled and addressed on it, he bustled out and vanished up the square. Bastian followed at the same headlong speed, and again overlooking the mat, came out on the pavement like an ill-started sprinter. Gayton Street, at which we shortly arrived, was gray and dingy, side street, exactly like a score of others in the same locality, with the number 23, which differed from the rest of the seedy-looking houses, in no respect, save that it was perhaps a shade more dingy. The door was open to answer to Bastian indecorously. Brisk knock by a woman, or perhaps I should say a lady, who at once admitted us to the home. Bastian began without preface to explain the situation. I got your note, Mrs. Samway. We're going to bring my friend here round to see the patient. Very unfortunate affair. Very sad. Unexpected, too. Didn't seem particularly bad yesterday. What time did it happen? I can't say exactly, was the reply. He seemed quite comfortable when he looked in on him the last thing at night. But when I went in about 7 this morning, he was dead. I should have let you know sooner, but I was expecting you to call. Yes, said Bastian. Very unfortunate. By the way, Mr. Maddock desired that his remains should be cremated. I think. Yes, so my husband tells me. He is the executor of the will. You remember, in the absence of any relatives, all Mr. Maddock's relations seem to be in America. Have you got the certificate forms? Asked Bastian. Yes, my husband got all the papers from the undertaker this afternoon. Very well, Mrs. Samway. Then we'll just take a look at the body, have to certify, and that I've seen it, you know. Mrs. Samway ushered us into the sitting room, where she had apparently been working alone, for an unfinished mourning garment on some kind of lay on the table. Leaving us here, she went away and presently returned with a sheaf of papers and a lighted candle. When we rose, and followed her to the back room on the ground floor. It was a smallish room, sparely furnished, with heavy curtains drawn across the window. By the wall, a bed on which a motionless figure, covered by a sheet, lay. Our conductress stood with the candlestick on the table by the bed, and stepped back to make way for Bastian, who drew back the sheet and looked down at the body in his peering, nearsighted fashion. The deceased seemed to be a rather frail-looking man of about 50, but beyond the fact that he was a clean-shaven man, I could not form very little idea of his appearance, since, in addition to the usual bandage under the chin to close the mouth, a tape had been carried round the head to secure a couple of pads of cotton wool over the eyes to keep the eyelids closed. As Bastian applied his stethoscope to the chest of the dead man, I glanced at our hostess, not without interest. Mrs. Samway was an unusual-looking woman, and I thought her decidedly handsome, though not attractive to me personally. She seemed to be about 30, rather over the medium height, and of fine Junoesque proportions, with a small head very gracefully set on her shoulders. Her jet-black hair, formally parted in the middle, was brought down on either side of her forehead in wavy but very smooth masses, and gathered behind a neat, precisely plaited coil. The general effect reminded me of the so-called Clyte tie, having the same reposefulness, thought not the gentleness and softness of that lovely head. But the most remarkable feature of this woman was the color of her eyes, which were of the palest gray or hazel that I have ever seen, so pale, in fact, that they told as spots of light, like the eyes of some lemurs, or of those of a cat seen in dusk, peculiarity that imparted a curiously intense, penetrating quality to her glance. I had just noted these particulars when Batson, having finished his examination, held out the stethoscope to me. "May as well listen as you're here," said he, and turning to our hostess, he added, "Let us see those papers, Mrs. Samway." As he stepped over to the table, I took his place on a chair by the bedside and proceeded to make an examination. It was, of course, only a matter of form, for the man was obviously dead, but having insisted so strongly on the necessity of verifying the death, I had to make a show of becoming skepticism. Accordingly, I tested both by touch and with the stethoscope the region of the heart. Needless to say, no heart sounds were to be distinguished, nor any signs of pulsation. Indeed, the very touch of my hand on the chilly surface of the chest was enough to banish any doubts. No living body could be so entirely destitute of an animal heartbeat. I laid down the stethoscope and looked reflectively at the dead man, lying so still and rigid, with his bandaged jaw and blindfolded eyes, and speculated vaguely on his personality when alive and on the hidden disease that had so suddenly cut him off from the land of the living. And insensibly, by habit, I suppose, my fingers strayed to his clammy pulse wrist. The sleeve of his nightshirt was excessively long, almost covering his fingers, and I had to turn it back to reach the spot where the pulse would normally be felt. In doing this, I moved the dead hand slightly, and then became aware of a well-marked rigor mortis of death stiffening in the arm of a corpse, a condition which I ought to have observed sooner. At this moment, happening to look up, I caught the eye of Mrs. Samway fixed on me with a very remarkable expression. She was leaning over Bastian as he filled up the voluminous certificate, but had evidently been watching me, and the expression of her pale, cat-like eyes left no doubt in my mind that she strongly resented my proceedings. In some confusion, and accusing myself of some failure in outward decorum, I hastily drew down the dead man's sleeve and rose from the bedside. "You noticed, I suppose," said I, "that there is fairly well marked rigor mortis?" "I didn't," said Bastian. "But if you did, it'll do as well. Better mention it to O'Connor when he comes. He ought to be here now." "Who is O'Connor?" asked Mrs. Samway. "Oh, he is the doctor who is going to sign the confirmatory certificate." Again, a gleam of unmistakable anger flashed from the hostess's eyes as she demanded, "Then who is this gentleman?" "This is Dr. Humphrey Jardine," said Bastian. "Apologies for not introducing him before. Dr. Jardine is taking my practice while I am away. I'm off tonight for about a week." Mrs. Samway withered me with a baleful glance of her singular eyes and remarkedly stiffly, "I don't require or quite see why you brought him here with you to see me and this man now fallen to his end." She turned her back on me, and I decided that Mrs. Samway was somewhat of a Tartar, though, to be sure, my presence was a distinct intrusion. I was about to beat a retreat when Bastian apologized, and his apologies were interrupted by a noisy rat-a-tat-tat on the street door. "Ah, here's O'Connor," said Bastian, and as Mrs. Samway went out to open the door, he added, "Seem to have put our foot in it, though I don't see why she need to have been so peppery about it. And O'Connor needn't have banged at the door like that, with death in the house. He'll get into trouble if he doesn't look out." Our colleague's manner was certainly not ingratiating. He burst into the room with his watch in his hand, protesting that he was 3 minutes late already, and he added, "If there is one thing I detest, it is being late at dinner. Got the forms?" "Yes," replied Bastian. "Here they are. That's my certificate on the front page. Yours is overleaf." Dr. O'Connor glanced rapidly down the long table of questions, muttering discontentedly, made careful external examination. "Have you made a post-mortem?" "No, of course I haven't." "What an infernal rigmarole. If cremation ever becomes general, there'll be no time for anything but funerals. Who nursed the deceased?" "I did," said Mrs. Samway. "My husband relieved me occasionally, but nearly all the nursing was done by me. My name is Letita Samway." "Was the deceased any relation of yours?" "No, only a friend. He lived with us for a time in Paris and came to England with us." "What was his occupation?" "He was nominally a dealer of artworks. Actually, he was a man of independent means. Have you any pecuniary interest in his death?" "He has left us about £70. My husband is the executor of the will." "I see. Well, I'd better have a few words with you outside, Bastian, before I make my examination. It's all confounded farce, but we must go through the proper forms, I suppose." "Yes, by all means," said Bastian. "Don't leave any loophole for queries or objections." He rose and accompanied O'Connor out into the hall, whence the sound of hurried muttering came faintly through the door. As soon as we were alone, I endeavored to make my peace with Mrs. Samway by offering apologies for my intrusion into the house of mourning. For the time being, I concluded, I am Dr. Batson's assistant, and as he seemed to wish me to come with him, I came without considering that my presence might be objected to. I hope you will forgive me." My humility appeared entirely to appease her. In a moment her stiff and forbidding manner melted into one that was quite gracious, and she rewarded me with a smile that made her face really charming. Of course, she said, it was silly of me to be so cantankerous and so rude, too. But it did look a little callous, you know, when I saw you playing with his poor dead hand. So you must make allowances. She smiled again, very prettily, and at this moment my two colleagues re-entered the room. Now then, said O'Connor, let us see the body, and then we shall have finished. He strode over to the bed, and turning back the sheet, made a rapid inspection of the corpse. Ridiculous farce, he muttered. Looks all right. Would in any case, though. Parcel of red tape. What's the good of looking at the outside of a body? Post-mortem's the only thing that has any use. What's this piece of tape plaster on the back? Oh, said Bastian, that's a little cut that he made by falling on the broken bottle. I stuck the plaster on because you can't get the bandage to hold satisfactorily on the back. Besides, he didn't want a bandage constricting his chest. No, of course not, O'Connor agreed. Well, it's all regular and straightforward. Give me the form and I'll fill it up and sign it. He seated himself at the table, looked once more at his watch, groaned aloud, and began to write furiously. The Egyptians weren't such bad judges, after all, he remarked as he laid down the pen and rose from his chair. Embalming may have been troublesome, but when it was done for good cause. The deceased was always accessible for reference in case of a dispute, and all this red tape was saved. Good night, Mrs. Samway. He buttoned up his overcoat and bustled off. In a minute or so later, we followed. By Jove, exclaimed Bastian. This business has upset my arrangements finely. I shall have to buck up if I'm going to catch my train. There's all the medicine to be made up and sent out, to say nothing of dinner, but dinner will have to wait until the business is all settled up. Don't you hurry, Jardine. I'll just run on and get to work. He broke into an elephantine trot and soon disappeared round the corner, and when I arrived at the surgery, I found him posting up the day-book and the speed of a parliamentary reporter. Bastian's dexterity with medicine bottles and wrapping paper filled me with admiration and despair. I made a futile effort to assist him, but in the end he snatched away the crumpled paper in which I was struggling to enswathe a bottle, dropped it into the waste paper basket, snatched up a clean sheet, and slap bang, in the twinkling of an eye, he had transformed the bottle into a neat little white parcel, as a conjurer changes a cocked hat into a guinea pig. It was wonderful. My host was a cheerful soul, but restless. He got up from the table no less than 6 times to pack some article that he had just thought of. And after dinner, when I accompanied him to his bedroom, I saw him empty his trunk with no less than 3 times to make sure that he had forgotten nothing. He quite worried me. Oh, you're over quick, man, is apt to wear out. That is, to wear out other people's nerves more than his own. I began to look anxiously at the clock and felt a real relief when the maid came to announce the cab was at the door. Well, goodbye, doctor, he sang out cheerily, shaking my hand thoroughly, the open window of the cab. Don't forget to keep the stock bottles filled. Save a world of trouble. And don't take too long on your rounds. Ta-ta! And the cab rattled away and went back into the house. A fulfilling blown general practitioner. That is to say, he was of the best type of practitioner, fully aware, fully prepared, and fully gone when needed to be. And that, my friends, is the end for this evening. I see that this book is fully informing us, and fully drawing each of the characters for us to know and understand before we get much further back into the mystery of the dead man on the side of the path. So we require some patience of our own to understand each character before we get back to the mystery. I hope your patience is holding well, and I hope that these investigations and these explanations of character are to your liking. Until tomorrow night, this is Indiana Holmes. See you tomorrow at 6 p.m. Love to you all. Good night.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.